Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Virtual SaaS Global Forum 2021. Our presentation is on SaaS time series analysis and forecasting, or TSAF, at the Canada Revenue Agency, the CRA, with COVID impacts. I'm Jason Oliver. I'm a project leader, senior compliance analyst, and data scientist with the CRA. I manage a team of data scientists in the pursuit of predictive analytics for tax-related data. I'm SAS certified, and I've used SAS extensively, as well as R and Python. About the Canada Revenue Agency, the CRA is Canada's federal tax administration, and as with all tax jurisdictions, the CRA has been challenged to keep pace with COVID-19 shocks and manifestations, which began in March 2020, which is the last month of our fiscal year. Fortunately, SAS Enterprise Miner has been an invaluable aid in gauging these impacts. So we'll begin with a glossary of terms to explain some of the key concepts. TSAF, as we know, is time series analysis and forecasting. TIBA is the tax earned by audit, which is the amount of tax collectible that is agreed upon in the course of a taxpayer audit. TAR is the tax at risk, which is the amount that CRA risk assessors arrive at as the precursor to auditing activity. The C to AR ratio is the ratio of audit cases completed to action requests submitted for assistance. And that's a tentative measure of auditor productivity. And lastly, Integris is the tool used by CRA auditors to process cases. Looking at time series functional nodes in SAS Enterprise Miner, we have 6 TSAF nodes in the time series ribbon, but we're only going to use 4 of them. So to begin, we're going to use the TS data preparation and TS decomposition nodes. I've abbreviated those. There's also the TS correlation node and the TS exponential smoothing node, which is used for forecasting. Very important, the role of your data source must be transaction, not raw or training or something else, for the TSAF nodes to work properly. For TSA initial setup, we're going to first scrutinize on the case to AR ratio as a tentative measure of auditor performance. This is the name of our diagram that we see here, and I drag and drop the dataset name that you see here. We'll be using that. Note that this is pre-aggregated data. It was pre-aggregated by month in SAS Enterprise Guide and then uploaded to the SAS server space. So I don't need to set my aggregation settings to average. It's already done for me. But if you were taking in raw data with hundreds or thousands of transactions, you would need to explicitly set your aggregation to average. Otherwise, it would set it to total. And I'm only using the case to AR ratio, which is my main input variable. The rest are set to rejected. And I'm going by month as my time ID. Looking at TSA components for the C to AR ratio, if we run the TS decomposition node, then we can see the graphs for trends, seasonality, and cyclical components, either in isolation or combined. But for here, the trend cycle component plot, we're really just concerned with trend because cycle is not really an intrinsic consideration in the tax sector. It's at best an inherited macro variable from world economy fluctuations. So the trend has been that the case to AR ratio has been going consistently downwards, meaning that auditors are completing fewer cases in relation to the number of action requests they submit for assistance. Looking at the seasonal component plot, the case to AR ratio is it ranges between about 1.3 down to 0.75. So it's at its highest towards the end of the fiscal year in about February or March, which makes sense because there are added pressures to close audit cases before the end of fiscal year. And it's at its lowest around May or August. And looking at average TIBA in place of the case to AR ratio, in this case, the trend is going steadily upwards and it reaches a virtual plateau in the high 50,000s range, average per case. The seasonal component plot, the seasonal index is a bit wider than what we saw for the case to AR ratio. It ranges from about 0.65 to 1.8. Again, very high around February to March, and it drops to the low end around May, August, and November. Now let's look at some forecasting going beyond our known data points. So when we use forecasting, we use the TS exponential smoothing node. And we let SAS Enterprise Miner pick the best forecasting method, as we see here, and the best selection criterion, which in this case, it defaults to the mean squared error. So when we use mean squared error, it draws a line of best fit with the blue dots. And those who have studied linear regression analysis will be familiar with this concept. And the red dots are the known actual points. So you can see that the forecast continues on a slight upward trajectory despite the March disruption because of series momentum. So it's probably a good thing that we began our forecast in January 2018. If we began before that, it would have more positive upwards momentum behind it. Also, when we look at the forecast lead, that's the number of months out we want to forecast minus the back period 6. That's sort of like our validation partition. So it takes the last 6 months of known data from October 2019 to March 2020 as our validation. And then effectively there's 12 months remaining from April 2020 to March 2021 as our forecast period. Our significance level is 0.5, which is a fairly reasonable significance band. We don't want it, too low, like 0.05, because then we would have a very wide prediction interval. So this is reasonable for all intents and purposes. In forecasting the sum of TIBA rather than average TIBA, we can see a drastic difference here, because unlike average TIBA or the K-star variable, which were ratio variables, sum total of TIBA is an absolute variable. So we'll notice more immediate discernible impacts to sum of TIBA as a result of the COVID fallout. Now, SAS, in auto-selecting the best forecast method, which in this case was multiplicative winters, meaning that it has strong seasonality and trend in a nutshell. So it's graphed a line of best fit, which are the blue points, around the known data, which are the red points. One interesting observation here is that the sum TIBA for February of 2020 is nearly double what it was for March 2020, as indicated by the red dots. But in spite of this, SAS thinks that the trend will continue positively because it's COVID agnostic. Now, in forecasting the K-star ratio, which is a fairly low continuous ratio variable, ergo we wouldn't group it with something like the sum of TIBA in a common forecast. But in this case, the prediction interval can be less reliable because it's a much lower scale. So ideally, what we want to do here is examine the midpoint distribution. What's most notable here is that while the midpoint post-March 2020 in the forecast tends to be at or above the 10.0 line, this is quite rare for the actual 2019 data points. And by the way, as I accumulated the real values for subsequent months of 2020, it was far below the 10.0 line. So this was obviously not an accurate forecast, which was otherwise disrupted by the effects of COVID fallout. Now, in forecasting the average hours per case, we also want to see how average hours per case is forecasted. And for this, I determined the more ideal selection criterion is median absolute predicted error. So the midpoint goes very subtly upwards for the first few forecasted points and then more sharply for the summer. But with a lower scale, the prediction interval becomes spurious because obviously you can't have negative hours. I had experimented with a range of selection criterions, but I could not overcome this issue of going into the negative range. And by the way, what you see here is actually pretty close to the actuals as I accumulated them from the known months of the remainder of 2020, whereby mid-2020 average hours per case was about 1.5 to 2 times the average hours for similar cases in the middle of 2019 and 2018. For instance, in April of 2019, the average hours per case were about 6.25, but for the same month in 2020, it was about 35.5 hours per case. Looking at incremental alignment for April 2020 with known values. So when we add the month of April 2020 to our data, making it 28 months in total, we would expect the average TIBA actuals for subsequent months to become closer to or more within the forecast range. For instance, the forecast for September, October, and December of 2020 become more within the range of the later known actuals once we add the April 2020 data. But there's one anomaly. The July 2020 actual of 122,000 is still well above the forecast band for this incremental data set's forecast. If we look at the forecast for July 2020, the upper limit of the forecast band, it's probably around about 66 or 67,000, which is a little more than half of our actual, so it's still well below. And by the way, this is because there was what we call a pulse in July, resulting from adjustments in workforce resulting from the COVID fallout. There was a temporary suspension of audit activity on small to medium business cases. It was just limited to larger business. And that embargo wasn't lifted until July. So clearly the addition of April wasn't enough to right the trajectory of the expanding COVID window. So I added May 2020 as an incremental known value month. And I changed the forecast significance level from 0.5 to 0.25, which gave me a wider prediction interval. But that made no difference because July actual was still out of the forecast range. So we need to simply accept that July 2020 was an irregular value at 122,000, simply because July 2018 had average TIBA of about 45,000, much less than 122K, and July 2019 had average TIBA of only 57,000. So this is likely a COVID adjustment spike from the auditor workforce adjustment and the lifting of the embargo on certain classifications of business size for audit cases. So we added June 2020 known values of average TIBA. And predictably for the addition of June, it really didn't improve the forecast band to include actual TIBA of July. So that strengthens the theory that July's value was a one-time event or a pulse in the time series from the workforce adjustment. It also strengthens the theory that average TIBA was much more resilient to initial COVID-19 transition measures. To witness that, note that the April, May, June line for the original forecast at left, which was just above 50,000, and then at right for the actuals, that was also just above the 50,000 line, and it follows a very similar trajectory. So that strengthens our theory. Now here's a fallacy comparing the sum of TIBA shift to the average TIBA changes. I sort of alluded to this earlier. TSA actually works best when you accumulate data records by the average, not by their sum total. So if we try this exercise using sum TIBA per month, it wouldn't work very well because sum totals are immediately impacted by any severe transition. They're not ratio variables. So case in point, the work rearrangements in March 2020 due to COVID. So in evaluating the March 2019 year-over-year comparison to March 2020, the sum of TIBA and case count have dropped significantly over that year in March 2020, yet the case to AR ratio went up. However, as the staffing situation attempted to stabilize in the intervening months during the first quarter of fiscal year 2020, the case to AR ratio has dropped dramatically. And the same is true for the TIBA to AR pattern. Looking at the drastic change of sum of TIBA in our forecast. So if the last month of our actuals is March 2020, 27 months of data, none of the actuals of the last 6 months of 2020 fall into the forecast band. And if we look at the last month of actuals for June 2020, just 2 of the actuals of those last 6 months, that is October and November, fell into the forecast band. So we'd also expect that lower average TIBA wouldn't manifest until the end of the fiscal year 2020 to 21 due to most of 2020 consisting of past year filings. So given this, we need to resort to the use of interventions in our time series, which is a manual effect we introduce in our time series for shocks that are due to extreme events. Notice here the lowest actual average TIBA value in 3 years is in December 2020. So we're seeing signs of average TIBA weakening due to the fallout of COVID. It's only 32,400, which is arguably the lowest value except for perhaps August of 2018. Speaking about interventions, a TSA may use interventions if the extreme or a regular event is known in advance. And this is an adjustment to the time series using what we call a dummy variable for the observation. We see examples of these input variables or dummy variables here, depending on the nature of the intervention. So an intervention would be recommended for the sum of TIBA as of March 2020 and for average TIBA as of December 2020. Plus, we would need a pulse effect for July 2020 because of that irregular one-time shock that we were talking about to average TIBA. If we want to program in an intervention, it would require SAS Studio, which is out of scope for this presentation. So a step effect would work best as an intervention for March and December of 2020 because the trend line shift is sudden and sustained. It doesn't happen gradually and then return to the baseline like a ramp would. So next, let's look at some autocorrelation. When we deal with a significant seasonal and/or trend component, we usually find a greater degree of autocorrelation, or ACF, autocorrelation factor. And as the name suggests, this is the tendency of a variable to self-influence. It might also be regarded as momentum or muscle memory, which stands to reason because as auditor teams are working on more frequently encountered cases, there's boilerplate templates, there's some more recognized patterns. So they notice a lot more momentum from familiar patterns. But obviously we don't see that so much in COVID where it's uncharted territory. We have less autocorrelation. So this uses the TS correlation node. And from the three variables we see here, estimated TAR, tax at risk, has fairly low ACF. TIBA, tax earned by audit, has moderately high ACF, and case hours has very high ACF. So a time lag T equals 5, for instance, TIBA reaches the 0 line already, but total hours is still at an ACF of 0.45. So this is autocorrelation for 2 years prior to the COVID era, from 2018 to 2019. If we compare this to autocorrelation patterns in 2020, well, obviously it's very weak. Strangely enough, it started becoming weak as of February, before the COVID effects hit in full force, which is somewhat mysterious, something that we can explore further in the companion paper to this presentation. So the ACF for both average TIBA and total hours in 2020 is very weak overall. Both dropped precipitously at the very outset of 2020, just before COVID-19 hit, and never fully recovers. It always hovers around the 0 line. Now we can look at CCA, cross-correlation analysis, which is the lagged effect between certain variables. In this case, for 4 years, we're looking at lagged effects for TAR, or the tax at risk, and TIBA, as well as those considering total hours spent on audit cases, or average hours per case, rather. So for time lag 3, this is a bit counterintuitive. Red means it has a very strong effect. Blue means a very weak effect or negative effect. So for time lag 3, the effect of total hours on TIBA is quite strong. Same with vice versa. Effect of TIBA, net present value on total hours, is moderately strong. But when we get to time lag 12 months out, that effect is greatly dampened, where we don't see much effect at all between total hours and TIBA, or vice versa, if we look at the colored scale. However, if we look at estimated tax at risk, or TAR, which is the precursor to auditing activity that's done by risk assessors for audit case selection later on, at time lag 3, we haven't built up enough of a buffer between case risk assessment and case audit. So we see very weak effect between TAR and total hours, or TAR and TIBA. But when we get to a year out, we see very strong effect between estimated TAR on TIBA as well as on total hours. So that's pre-COVID. Now, if we look at cross-correlation analysis during the COVID era, it's understandably very weak. For time lag 3 at left, the best we can get is 3% influence for any given variable pattern, or negative 56% at the other extreme. And if we go to 12 months out, it's absolutely nothing. Now let's look at some categorical analysis. Using the same data set for CCA, we can subdivide our data set by industry sector, or NAICS code. And I can set this input to cross ID in the data sources variables list. Then I rerun my diagram flow in SAS. From the TS data prep node's results, we right click in the time series plot and we select data options. So we'll pick a NAICS code at random, which is number 56 here. And you can see that it took a tumble at the outset of COVID and struggled to regain its footing, yet apparently it exceeded that at calendar year end. By December, it was average TIBA per case of about 1.5 million. And as you recall, the average TIBA in the aggregate was only about 32,000. So this industry sector defied all expectations. By the way, if you have more than 100 of a certain categorical code, SAS Enterprise Miner will only take the first 100 codes. So obviously for NAICS industry code, we have a lot more than 100. We can only get the first 100 codes. In my opinion, I actually prefer using SAS VIA for doing categorical subsetting of time series analysis. Now let's subset by the tax service office TSO category. If I want to subset by TSO, once again, I set my case TSO ID input to cross ID at the data source node, and then I rerun the time series data diagram. But once again, by default, this displays all TSOs in the input time series plot, which can get rather messy because I have about 40 of them. So I need to right-click this plot area and select data options to specify the where conditions, the filters. So I'm filtering on TSO categories of ID 5, 18, and 40. So we see an interesting pattern here where in the first quarter of the calendar year 2020, these three TSOs had virtually identical average TIBA. But when it comes to April, this TSO, number 18, had average TIBA per case of about 600,000, whereas for the other TSOs, it was below 10,000 per case. And then we see another spike, albeit not as strong, of perhaps around 325,000 in August of 2020. And then it approaches convergence again for the remaining months of 2020. So that concludes our presentation on TSAF at the CRA during COVID using SAS Enterprise Miner. I thank you all for attending, and I'm certainly open to questions. Optionally, my contact email address is also provided here. So I wish you well in the remainder of the Global Forum. Thank you.